Welcome to the Protecting Your Nest podcast. There are many reasons to consider a low carb, keto, or carnivore diet as a tool to improve your health. Rather, it leads to weight loss, reversing chronic medical conditions like diabetes, hypertension, migraines, cognitive decline, and many, many more. Some of us are still questioning whether a diet where meat is not demonized but celebrated is the right way for humans to eat. Today, I have asked my guest, Professor Tim Noakes, to take us to class, a classroom where we will learn why we should not only not fear meat, but maybe instead celebrate it as a foundational part of our health-related journey. In December 2010, Professor Tim Noakes was introduced to a way of eating that was contrary to everything he had been taught. At that time, he started to experience the many benefits of low carb, high fat diets. Unfortunately, when he optimistically shared his findings publicly in 2012, instead of being celebrated, he received a backlash from his colleagues in the medical establishment that culminated in a misconduct inquiry launched by the Health Professions Council of South Africa. The subsequent hearing unnecessarily put Professor Tim Noakes through a stressful experience, but he ultimately triumphed, being found not guilty of unprofessional conduct in April 2017. He is now considered one of the top 5 influential scientists in the world, and we really thank him for his sacrifices. In his book, Lore of Nutrition, he explains the science behind the low-carb, high-fat Banting diet and why he champions this lifestyle despite the constant persecution and efforts to silence him. His research has given him a unique historical perspective, and it's one that I really feel will be helpful for anyone pondering, as Dr. Ken Berry would say, what is the proper human diet? And with that, Professor Noakes, it is my pleasure to welcome you to Protecting Your Nest. How's things going for you this morning?
Tony, thank you. I'm really looking forward to our chat. It's wonderful to be with you, and I have such admiration for what you're doing.
Thank you. Well, again, inspired by the best. I appreciate that. And again, we have a little bit more courage because of what you've been through. So let's begin our conversation with you telling us a little bit about the world you enjoy in South Africa. You know, as an African American, I am hoping to visit Africa in the very near future. My oldest son, his name is Brandon. He actually did the ancestry test, and what we found is that the largest percentage of our background is from Nigeria, which is certainly more centrally located in Africa. So very exciting. So what I want to ask you just as a icebreaker is, what distinguishes Southern Africa, where you are, from other parts of Africa like Central Africa and Nigeria? And if I came to visit there, what would I expect to see?
Well, I think you'd be quite surprised at how cosmopolitan Cape Town is, my city. And South Africa was a typical African country until 1860s, 1870s, when gold was discovered and diamonds first and then gold. And that brought the Industrial Revolution to this country, and it put it on a pedestal similar to Nigeria, so that it has a very strong infrastructure, good industry. And I think that would be one of the features that might be different. For example, I was born in Zimbabwe, and I'm very proud of that. But Zimbabwe is not as well developed commercially as South Africa is, as industrially is. And so you would see the difference. So I think if you came to Cape Town, it would be very similar to San Francisco. I mean, it's not all that different. It's not quite
Really?
but yeah.
Oh, wow, that would be a surprise. Yeah, see, we all have our little perceptions of what, Africa is, and would be, and I think that's the value of traveling and experiencing the rest of the world. You have to get out there, but I'm really looking forward to it. I want to see how much I look like the people who started this journey for my culture. I can't wait, man. So my oldest son, Brandon, he actually has a podcast himself. It's called Ritmos Negros, and he talks about the connection between Africa and the Latin American culture. So he shares. So it's really a great podcast, and he kind of followed in my footsteps. So So thank you for that
Yeah,
icebreaker.
can I just butt in there? I had one of the greatest years of my life was in Los Angeles, California.
Really?
I was an exchange student at a small, fabulous school, fabulous area. It was the most remarkable. And I was called brother by the African Americans because they
Is that
recognized
right?
me
Interesting.
as African. So, and my great friend was Tyrone, and he would call me, "Hi, brother."
Oh,
Tyrone
right. I
Towers.
love that.
Yeah.
I love that. Well, that's I'm gonna hold on to that. So if I hit you with that every once in a while, so I love it. So that's wonderful. So let's dive a little deeper. Today really what I wanted to do, Professor, is to help our listeners understand the history of how we ended up eating the way we eat today. It seems we are not really as healthy as we once were in the past. So give me a sense from your perspective, what happened that led us to being a little less healthy as a species?
Yeah, I think I could focus on two populations, one closer to yourself and one closer to myself. So if I went back to my great great grandmother living and grandparents living in England in the Victorian era, they were incredibly healthy. They had a life expectancy which was pretty similar to ours. There was no heart disease, no cancer, no chronic autoimmune diseases. And they did very well because they ate the food that came directly from the farms. There was lots of dairy produce, meat, sheep and lamb, etc. And they did eat their vegetables. And they were, as I've said, they were incredibly healthy. And if they didn't die in childhood and for early infections, they had the same life expectancy that we have. There's a lovely book of a similar experience by a Scottish general practitioner who describes going to the Second World War, fighting the war, comes back to his town in the northern parts of Scotland, and how healthy the people were. But within the 40 years that he practiced general practice in the Highlands, the health of the population completely deteriorated. And it was during that period that the so-called industrial diet arrived. And that's what would have happened to my great great grandmother and subsequent generations. That the commercial diet came in with lots of sugar, vegetable oils, refined food, refined carbohydrates, and eating the food directly from the farm was didn't happen as much. And that's when our health started to deteriorate. And if we look at the Plains Indians in North America, exactly the same. When they were eating just buffalo, they were unbelievably healthy. They were the tallest populations in the world and amongst the healthiest. And the scouts from the cavalry who went and would scout through these Indians, they said they'd never seen a healthier population of better built humans than they found on the plains in the Plains Indians. And the Plains Indians ate basically meat. That's what they ate. But they knew exactly what part of the buffalo to eat. For example, they knew that the adrenal glands contained vitamin C, and so that they would give the adrenal glands to the people who needed the vitamin C when they needed it. So they had an understanding of nutrition that we simply didn't have. Now, I became interested in diet from being a runner, as you perhaps mentioned. I was first a long distance runner and promoted this high carbohydrate diet because that was the dogma. And I became sick as a result, but that's not the point. The point was I understood the biology of how humans have adapted for running. And that happened right here in Africa. And it was because the early hominids, that's pre-humans, the early hominids learned how to run and chase antelope. And that's why we became such good runners in the heat. And we could run these animals to their exhaustion, and then they couldn't kill us because they were so exhausted they couldn't use their horns to kill us or whatever. And so that's how we was one of the ways we originally started to hunt animals. And then as we became more efficient with clubs and with spears and arrows, then it became different. It's now thought that humans were so successful in killing the very large animals that we completely wiped them out on every continent that we went on. We wiped out the heavier, the fattest animals, and I explained in due course why it was the fat animals that we went for. So these were these mega enormous animals, rhinoceroses, elephants, and early humans had no difficulty killing them. We killed them so successfully, we wiped them out off the continents. And there's an Israeli scientist who believes that as we killed them off, we had to learn new ways to find food. And that's why agriculture came along. But
Hmm.
we weren't adapted to agriculture because we were adapted to digesting meat and fat and protein, not vegetables. And that's where the problem arose. And if you
Wow.
look back at the Egyptians, the Egyptian mummies and so on, they're not healthy, and they were eating a classic high carbohydrate grain based diet. They were known as the bread eaters, and they were not healthy. So when we started eating grains 10,000 years ago, that was the start of the problem. The next problem was when the diet became completely industrialized, and we added sugar and refined carbohydrates, and that really was the end for us in terms of our health.
Yeah, it sounds like having a real good sense of history really helps. I remember seeing images of Egyptians, and they all had like big bellies, literally like the abdominal obesity that we always tell our patients they should worry about. And they certainly had big bellies. And I could imagine eating all those grains back then. Even as you also comment on the indigenous Americans in this country, I had Jamie Standeval. She was on podcast episode number 33, and she's in New Mexico, and she's doing a great job serving that community. And they have, in America, they probably have the highest incidence of diabetes. And again, they're probably supposed to be eating buffalo,
Mm.
and understanding that unfortunately you didn't just strip their land, you actually stripped their food. And when you take away the buffalo, it really puts them in a situation where their body doesn't have time to adapt, if it would ever adapt to eating that way. So it's very nice to have that perspective, because it really takes us back ancestry to the types of foods that maybe we should be eating. So thank you for sharing that. And it makes me also wonder, how do we then determine, what we should or shouldn't be eating? So, it sounds like part of that discussion goes back ancestry. So what's your thoughts on what the average human should be thinking about when they are trying to determine what's the best diet for them?
It's really interesting. I think that you have to look back to your great great grandparents and see what they were eating. And I do think there are regional differences. And I've spoken to a lot of Persian people from
Right.
Iran, and they say, don't tell us not to eat cereals and grains, because we're the people who discovered them and invented them, and we love them, and we're well adapted to them. And they look pretty lean and healthy as the Iranians I've seen. So I think if you came from Persia and those areas, it might well be that you could eat a much higher cereal diet. I come from the north of England, and that's clearly there no cereals and grains growing in the north of England, because until 10,000 years ago it was under ice. So what could we have been eating? We had to be eating animals, and that's about it. If you look at the Southern African indigenous South African peoples, the Nguni tribes, when they came into Southern Africa about 1,000 years ago, they brought their cattle with them. And then we had two events. The rinderpest was a viral infection that went through the cattle in Africa and wiped out the cattle. And that forced many black South Africans to move to the cities. And guess what they started eating when they moved to the cities? And that's where the diabetes obesity problem starts in Southern Africa. And it was, in my view, that South Africans, Xhosa speaking, Zulu speaking South Africans, are adapted to a high protein, high fat diet. But that's been taken away from them, and they've converted also to this terrible diet that the Plains Indians are eating, and that's the problem. That's the cause of the problem.
Wow, it's pretty amazing. Another thing that I noticed as you did your research, you didn't just look at what people were eating. You actually went a little further and became an archaeologist and start looking at skulls and things like that. So it seems like the skulls of like vegetarians and carnivores are not quite the same. So tell us a little bit about what we can learn from the skulls of our ancestors to kind of give us some nutritional perspective.
Yeah, I was very fortunate to actually have held some of the oldest hominid
Oh,
skulls.
did you?
I've
Wow.
actually held them, and because a friend of mine was, I'll tell you what happened. I helped him run a very long race in South Africa. I treated him. I think I gave him a placebo, and he finished the marathon. And he was convinced that I saved his running career. Anyway, he became the head of the major museum, and he said, "Tim, to thank you, I'm going to allow you to hold this 2.7 million-year-old skull, and it's an amazing feeling. It's just astonishing." And her name was Mrs. Ples, and she had reasonable teeth, but you're quite right. And I think that you obviously are very well knowledgeable about Weston Price, the dentist from, I think, Cincinnati, who
That's right.
travels around the world to discover what the people are eating who haven't changed their diets. They haven't been so-called civilized. They haven't met up with the so-called industrial diet. And he, you know why he did it? He did it for two reasons. Because he noticed that the children in Cincinnati were getting more cavities, but he noticed that the children with type 1 diabetes weren't. And he asked the question, what's different? And the children with type 1 diabetes were being fed a high-fat diet because it was the only diet on
Right.
which they could survive before insulin was discovered. So
Right.
he noticed they had perfect teeth. So he said, and then he went and looked at the South African skulls and he found that they had perfect teeth. So he said, I'm sure it's a dietary change. And then he went around the world and was able to document that the more industrialized the diet, the worse your teeth. And so but it was interesting that he did look at South African skulls to give him some of that hypothesis.
Wow, that's awesome. Well, thank you for that again. I think, again, going backwards, we have to go quite far back to get that data, but it's nice to know that it provides some understanding. Another thing that is interesting when we go backwards, we think about our closest living relative would be like the chimpanzees as an example. So do me a favor and take a moment and I want to contrast the diets of humans versus maybe chimpanzees and maybe even compared to gorillas. When I look at gorillas, they're like these monsters, right? I mean, every time I go to the zoo, that's the only time I'll see. I don't know where you see them, but I see them at the zoo. And they're just monsters and they're sitting there eating, plants. So talk a little bit about the difference between the digestion of food for humans, chimpanzees, and gorillas.
Excellent. Well, gorillas eat roots and shoots exclusively, whereas chimpanzees also eat fruits.
Okay.
And they do hunt. They do hunt other monkeys. But interestingly, they can only hunt them for about 20 minutes and then they have to stop because they've got to get back to eating. Because when you're
Wow.
eating this plant-based diet, you've got to be eating 12, 14 hours a day.
Just like the cows in America, they're just grazing all day long. It's crazy.
Right. Now, the interesting thing is that to digest roots and shoots, you need bacteria to do it for you because the cellulose is the nutrient that you've got to digest. But humans cannot digest it, but bacteria can, and only bacteria can digest cellulose. So when you look at a gorilla, it's got this huge gut, and many people think that's probably fat. No, it's not. That's a huge intestine which has all these bacteria in it, and they voraciously breaking down the cellulose. And the really interesting thing is, guess what they're converting the cellulose into? They're converting it into saturated fats.
Wow.
So that's and the same with your ruminants, the cattle you're talking about. They take nutrient poor grass and roots and shoots and convert it into saturated fatty acids, which then the body can use. And I think what happened, I like to suggest this, that humans evolved when we realized that let those animals convert the grass into saturated fatty acids, and we'll then eat the saturated fatty acids and make our brain big and healthy. And so we're both specialists. The
That's
antelopes and the cattle are specialists to produce this fat. And by the way, they also produce protein from the dead bodies of the bacteria. So those bacteria produce not only the saturated fats, but the protein. So when you eat your protein steak, you're actually eating protein that came from bacteria in the ruminant's gut. So it's
Wow, that's
really interesting.
crazy. Well, shout out to all the animals we eat that allow me to eat my to bypass that step. I think eating the steak is way more fun. So I do appreciate that. Trust me, I've been a steak guy forever, so I really appreciate that. Any extra thoughts on how eating meat will actually equal a larger brain? I mean, just comment a little bit more on that. I think a lot of people want to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I think that one of the key findings is that the brain is so much made of so much fat, and there are essential fats. There are two essential fatty acids that you need, and they're more easily obtained from meat and fish and dairy than they are from plants. The plants do have traces of them, but they're not in a form that's as easily digested as from meat and other animal produce. And that's a real concern for vegetarians, that they may not be getting all the key nutrients that they need, particularly the fatty acids that they need, and as well as some vitamins which tend to go with the fatty acids as well. So that's the problem. And so it's thought that was the first thing. The second thing was we had this high energy diet, and therefore we could go and do other things as well. We didn't spend all the time eating, which was another important change in developing our brains. A very important point is that most of our brain growth occurs in the first 2 years of our life. And that's when we really need the fats.
Oh, so that's why my babies had such a big head, and shout out to all the ladies out there who have to push these big heads out of their bodies. That explains a lot.
Yeah. And
I
you're
remember
quite right.
actually, I remember learning that in medical school. I
That's
remember
right.
they talked a little bit about that, so so it's good so that's good. It's good to kinda connect those dots a little bit. Another thing that I thought was interesting is, we talk a lot in the low carb community about macronutrients that you should or shouldn't have, and most people listening know that you have carbohydrates, fat, and protein as the macronutrients that we can use. So, when you did your research, did you see that the consumption of macronutrients kind of changed? Going from one more to the other. What did you find as you did research comparing the ancestors, their macronutrient composition versus today?
Yeah, no, well, it's very much changed. It's changed hugely. And the big changes in carbohydrates. So the bottom line is the problem. So you have to get 100% of calories. Now, the, there is a limit to how much protein you can safely assimilate, because we don't have a big liver and a big kidney that can excrete the breakdown products of the proteins. And there's an argument of how much that can be, but I know that people are eating up to 40% protein. So let's say that that's an upper limit. Many will argue that you can actually go to 50%, but you can't go higher because eventually your health will deteriorate. So let's stick it at 40%, which is very high. There are very few people in the world eating 40% protein, but let's just stick that. So then you've got to get your other 60% from something.
Right.
Now, what humans found was if they could find very fat animals, they could get the other 60% purely from these fat animals, but they had to be rhinoceroses and
Mhm.
elephants and hippopotamuses. The antelope are very lean. Most antelope are extremely lean. So killing antelope wasn't helpful because you didn't get your 60% fat that you needed. You might get your 40% protein, but you didn't get your 60% fat. So then you had to go and find other foods for the carbohydrates would have to make up the other bit. And it's important to make the point that carbohydrates are non-essential. They're only there as a filler to make up this gap. So if you look back at the diets of the people living in the northern extremes in the Arctic, for example, they probably had 60 to 70% fat and 30 to 40% protein and zero carbohydrate. But then as you move towards the equatorial areas and the animals were not as big and they weren't as fat, then you would find up to, say, 10, 20% carbohydrate in the diet. But that shifted completely. So now we're told that we must eat at least 50, 55%, 60% carbohydrate. So we've gone from being 0 or 20% carbohydrate to 60% carbohydrate. And that's happened literally since 1977.
Oh, wow.
That's when the big change becomes evident. Maybe not from 20%, but definitely from 40% carbohydrate. So that our grandparents may have eaten 30 to 40% carbohydrate, but we now are encouraged to eat 60 to 65% carbohydrate.
Wow.
And this change is dramatic. It's just too much for us to cope with.
It's way too much, and even if I know in America there are different foods that we eat compared to in Africa and South Africa, and as you talked about that, you made me think about. I think you guys eat. I think it's called maize, right?
Maize,
So what led to maize being the primary food in Africa? Because I know it sounds very starchy, right? So tell me a little bit about how that transition occurred.
So I mentioned earlier that the South Africa went through an industrial revolution in the 1860s because they were discovered diamonds and then gold. And they discovered gold in Johannesburg, which was right in the center of South Africa. And it's well away from the sea, and there was no food. South Africa was a very poor agricultural country in the 1960s and the 1860s and the 1880s. And all of a sudden, from all over the world, you had this huge influx of people into Johannesburg, and they had to find food. But the farmers, there was not enough food. So they started importing food from the local country, particularly Lesotho, grown by the farmers in Lesotho. And that was imported. And what they grew was maize. So maize became the food. What the South African government realized in the 1910s and 1920 was that they'd made so much money from gold that they said, well, let's invest it in developing a maize belt. And so they developed this huge maize belt, which covers a huge proportion of the central South Africa, where maize is the staple food. And that became the staple food. And it's astonishing because that's in 1920 or so. Maize, which was imported from South America, it was not a stable African staple. It comes from South America, and today I can't imagine it's probably 40% of the calories consumed in South Africa are maize. It could well be more than that.
What?
Yeah,
40%? How is it? What could be a little bit more descriptive? So I'm not familiar with maize, but how,
we
in
call it
what
corn.
ways is it being, yeah, how is it? It's like corn. So basically you put it in everything,
That's
basically
right.
just like in America.
You'd eat it
And
as
we
a cereal,
And
breakfast.
we also, because of the USDA and the subsidizing of farmers, which we want to subsidize farmers, we want to make sure we have food. The problem is that we subsidize farmers with the caveat you need to create all this product that we don't need, right? So, how about if we subsidize farmers and don't require that they make things that we don't need? That's it seems like a simple solution, but yeah, if you open up any package in America, anything in a box, you pretty much will find corn. In fact, I think in your research, you also did a little research about where all the processed food comes from. So, and I think you mentioned there's only a few companies that make all. So, comment a little bit about that, a little bit about the fact that there's just a few companies that control everything.
Yeah, I think there are about 10 companies, and they're probably all North American. And every other
Don't
every
talk about my
other
country.
producer. And then they have all these smaller companies. So that's the problem. And they control everything. And then, as I think we've maybe discussed before, that when they took fat out the diet, according to the 1977 dietary guidelines, the foods tasted terrible. And then they realized they had to
Right.
replace it with something. So they put sugar in. And then these manufacturers realized that they could addict the world to their sugar. And then they started using high fructose corn syrup, which was cheaper
That's right.
and just sweeter and more addictive. And that really put us on a particular path to obesity and diabetes.
That's right. And I think the research on high fructose corn syrup and being able to use it that way was done in Japan. And then it just kind of expanded out. When I did research for my first book, Fix Your Diet, Fix Your Diabetes, I learned a little bit about that history. So it's just you wish all these decisions were based on what was going to make the population healthier, and a lot of times it comes down to money and things like that. So it's unfortunate that that's how we're being given guidance. So another thing that I'm curious about is your past. You're like me. I wasn't a runner, but I was absolutely a vegetarian for a long time, low fat kind of guy. And, I felt compared to the standard American diet, I actually felt pretty good. But I always felt gassy and I always
Mm.
felt hungry. And I never really thought much about it. I just thought that you just take some Beano and you call it a day. So,
Yeah.
but anyway, so I'm curious now that we've both transitioned away from a plant-based diet and we both benefited, and I'm still in the omnivore category. Although most days, not I feel like I'm a carnivore, because I feel comfortable eating meat without fear. So I'm curious where you are personally on your dietary journey. Like, are you still an omnivore? Are you moving towards carnivore? What kind of dietary approach do you generally take?
So my background, just to rephrase, was that I was actually brought up by my mother, whose father was involved in the meat trade in Britain. So she raised me on meat and offal. We used to have offal for breakfast. And then, of course, I went to medical school and I became clever. And then I had to change. And then we had to eat carbs. And I would try to not eat any fat. That's on a day. And if I didn't eat fat, I would think that was a good thing. And I got slowly fatter and my running got less good.
Mm,
And the only thing that actually helped me was to run enormous volume of miles and also very long distances in training, in races. So I loved the race. I only got going after 40 miles because then my ketones would start working. I'd get depleted of carbohydrates and then I would start feeling good because I was self-treating my diabetes without realizing,
right,
of
right.
course. And I have data on myself showing I was profoundly insulin resistant at 28. Even though I was lean and running marathons, I was still profoundly insulin resistant. And when I think back, I know exactly what happened. As I started to run less and eat more carbs, just everything
That's right.
went wrong. And then fortunately, I read Eric Westman's book, The New Atkins for the New You. And I was astonished. I was so angry when I saw the title. I thought, this man's sold out. How can he tell us to eat saturated fat? So I went and bought the book, and literally within 2 hours, I said, I got it all wrong. Why? Because he had 150 studies of low carbs,
That's right.
improving health and so on. And I could see in myself exactly what he was describing. I was the person that they were treating. And so if they had treated all these people and had been successful, surely I would also benefit. And literally within 6 weeks, I was a new person. So
Wow.
then, and then originally I cut carbs right down and probably to 50 grams and then 25 grams. And I'm probably closer to 10 grams a day at the moment. And I have definitely moved to more carnivore diet.
Yeah.
I eat relatively few vegetables. Not that they disagree with me. It's just that I don't see the need for them. And I'm what I've picked up in the last month or two was that I picked up a little weight, maybe a kilogram or two during the lockdown. And then I started reading a bit more widely. And I said, but I'm not eating more carbs, but I was eating more
Hmm.
fat. And then I've decided to cut the fat a little bit and eat more protein. So I came across Dr. Ted Naiman's hypothesis that you need to start at 40% protein.
Hmm.
That needs to be your base. And then you add the fat to that. So I'm working to get my protein intake up a bit and see what happens. It's interesting because being diabetic, you'd think eating protein isn't so good because it causes insulin secretion, whereas fat doesn't. So I'm interested to see what happens. So that's my experiment at the moment. I'm going towards more lean meat rather than fatty meat, which was what I started on. Let me say originally that the fatty foods really worked because they took away my hunger, and I lost 22 kilograms just like that. on a high fat diet. But I think things have changed a bit now, and I need to cut back a little bit on the fat and eat more protein. And the reason why that's happened, I don't know, but I observe that needs to be done.
Yeah, I think you make a couple of really good points. One is that we use the term bio-individuality. I mention that term a lot because I want people to understand that, there's not one size fits all. When you talked earlier about these different cultures and, ancestrally, we may have to lean towards a different diet based on our past. That's number one. Number two, we may have to do our own experiment. You would think that, Professor Tim Noakes would have figured it out by now, right? So, and the fact that you're still trying to figure it out is only a reflection that we all are on our own
Yeah.
personal journey. So everybody who, sees this podcast and or hears it, make sure that you do your own experiment and honor your body. Your body will tell you what you need to know. You just have to listen to it and pay attention to it. And another point you made, I think that's really critical, is that I have some people I see on social media who are doing marathons, but they're clearly obese, right? You're like, how do you do a marathon and still be overweight or obese? And the answer is you can't out exercise a bad diet. It's just almost impossible. I mean,
Yeah.
it's still, my brain still can't understand how you even got close to diabetes doing
Yeah.
that type of work, but it happened. So I think people really want to walk away and understand the importance of doing that. So, but there's other things out there that can harm us, and I learned. And by the way, before I even comment on that, shout out to people who have influenced us. Dr. Kim Berry, I know he's more of a carnivore these days. Dr. Sean Baker, of course, I'm sure he's influenced all of us. And the Black Carnivore, who I had on my podcast previously, she's trying to engage the communities of color as well to be okay with carnivore. So I want to do a shout out to her. But I really want to also look at this idea of vegetable oils just a little bit. And part of me says, you just have to do what you have to do based on your resources. Some people can't afford really good, pure avocado oil, really good, pure, extra, 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 extra virgin olive oil. Because a lot of times they cut it with the seed oils. But could you comment a little bit about the harm that the seed oils, the harm that they can cause?
I think that the best way I can explain that is that, as we've discussed, we evolved eating saturated fat over these millions of years. And so that's what our body's designed. It uses those saturated fats to build all the cell membranes throughout the body. Now, if you take out the saturated fat and replace it with polyunsaturated fats, which have only been around, since 1910, that's when they start to be introduced by Procter and Gamble. So that's 1910, like that's 110 years or so. Now, your cells cannot incorporate the polyunsaturated fats as well as the saturated fats. So every single cell in your body is going to be functioning suboptimally if you're eating polyunsaturated fats. And the suboptimal function is going to cause long-term harm. A lot of my colleagues think that cancers are directly linked to polyunsaturated fats, particularly if you're cooking with them because they form toxic aldehydes. And many people think that they're linked to brain disorders, which is logical because your brain is all the membranes there. They need saturated fat. I'm just looking at three studies in the United States of America. The one was the Women's Health Initiative, which I've had a long interest with, and by the way, on the first week of January, the Journal of American Medical Association produced this unbelievable paper, which I've just happen to have here because I'm writing it up, and I'll just leave it
Oh
there.
yeah, I see. Association of lipid and inflammatory and metabolic biomarkers with age at onset for incident coronary heart disease in women. Okay, gotcha. Perfect.
And now this paper disproves the low-fat diet heart hypothesis absolutely and completely.
Wow.
Although it comes from the Women's Health Initiative, which was set up to prove the low-fat diet makes us healthy,
Right.
it's proved the opposite. And I wrote an article some time ago showing where the Women's Health Initiative had hidden data. Turns out they even hid more data in their more recent papers. But this paper is written by different people than those papers. So I don't know quite why they're different. Anyway, they looked at predictors of risk of heart disease over 20 years. And there was one risk factor: insulin resistance.
Wow.
Diabetes, insulin resistance. If you had diabetes, your risk was tenfold increased. If your cholesterol was elevated, is 1.3-fold increase, which is utterly irrelevant. And so this is the study proving that it's all insulin resistance. And
I love it.
yeah. So that's the Women's
Well,
Health Initiative, which told us we must eat less fat. Is wrong. They caused the problem. And then there are the famous recovered Minnesota coronary experiment and the recovered Sydney diet heart study, and which both show harm of replacing saturated fat in the diet with polyunsaturated fats. So the Women's Health Initiative reduced the saturated fat intake, caused harm. The other two studies increased the polyunsaturated fat intake, reduced saturated fat intake, caused harm. So what is a doctor? We know it's harmful to change the saturated fat consumption. That's the key.
wow. Well, you're preaching to the choir. When I made, I'm so happy you showed that study, and I'm hoping that everybody listening will take a moment to, dot your I's and cross your T's. So you're not supposed to fully trust Dr. Hampton, Professor Tim Noakes. You can go look at these studies yourself, and it's really critically important to do that. I've been trying to share the message, and that's why I have Metabolic Syndrome on my website. And I was going to just say keto, blah, blah, blah. I went with Metabolic Syndrome because if you talk to any cardiologist, he or she'll tell you that a lot of the patients that they are doing procedures on actually had a normal cholesterol. So if they have a normal cholesterol, why are we so focused on cholesterol, right? Metabolic syndrome and insulin resistance is what we're finding is the key. And for those who are not aware, we're looking at the blood pressure, your blood sugar, your abdominal obesity, and then of course, instead of focusing on total cholesterol and LDL, we're focused on the triglycerides and the HDL. So for anybody listening who's not familiar with that, that's where I would put the focus right now. And there's various ways to measure that. But I also encourage people to get a coronary artery calcium score test just to see where you are. And if you have a really good score that's like 0, for example, you're probably doing okay. You're eating an ancestry appropriate diet. But if it's a little higher than that, then that may be something that you need to follow. And as we make changes in our diet, we need to have a tool to follow to help us decide what the next step should be. So thank you for making that correlation. Another thing I wanted to briefly touch on is muscle and how in a world. One of the things I struggle with is I have to like eat more to maintain my weight. Look, when you eat keto, you're not gonna. It's a struggle to like gain weight, if anything. So you're an athlete and you've done that most of your life. So what's your thoughts on low carb or keto and building muscle? Is it harder, easier, more sustainable? What's been your experience?
Well, I think all the evidence shows that if you're eating a keto diet, the one thing you don't increase is your visceral fat, and that's critically important. So all the studies I've read of athletes who are put on a keto diet versus this standard low-fat diet, the keto group lose weight, but it's largely visceral fat that they lose, and they don't lose much muscle. If any, the athletes I've worked with, world-class athletes, they put on muscle on this diet. So I don't see any reason. And I've incidentally started doing weight training at the age of 71, and I put on muscle, which you can do it at 71, then you can do it at any age.
That's right. That's right. One
Yeah,
of my patients, by the way, I have an 85-year-old, and every time he comes to clinic, you can see the muscle through his chest. It's like he's built. I mean, it's like he's 85. He looks great. So I have confirmation that that's true.
yeah. So what it does seem is that it's difficult to put on weight. You're quite right, because you lose visceral fat, and you lose so much visceral fat that if you just look at weight, you'll get it all wrong. You'll
Hmm.
think that you've lost muscle mass, but no. I help one of the premier rugby players in the world, and who's built like, I mean, is like an Adonis already. And but that was on a high carb diet, and he converted to this diet. He lost 2 kilograms of visceral fat, and he put on 3 kilograms of muscle, so that he went from Adonis to double Adonis.
Oh, wow.
And he's known as one of the toughest players in the world. And he said it made a massive difference to him. So,
I love it.
and I watch the American basketball players, and I just have a feeling that many of them have converted to a more animal-based diet, and they've moved away from and these are not small men.
Not at all. They're giants. I know
Yeah.
LeBron had done it previously. I'm not sure if he still is. I know Kobe, before he passed, he had. So a lot of athletes, even Serena Williams, had done it. So I think a lot of people are doing that, and I think that's and they're definitely they're specimens for sure. So that's
Yeah.
for sure. Another thing that I wanted to just touch on briefly is this idea of having to have a balanced diet. So most of the professionals in the nutrition space, they've been taught that way. Even in my training with University of Western States, as I'm getting a master's in nutrition, there is a little bit of a suggestion that there's balance that's needed. So what's your thoughts on the need for balance in a diet?
Well, there's no animal on the planet Earth who eats a balanced diet. so, so why
That's a good
humans should
answer.
suddenly be the balanced diet ones, I don't know.
Yeah, I
You know,
can't imagine a lion saying, "You know what? Make sure I get my broccoli in." With that. That's a good point.
that's exactly right.
Yeah,
We're designed to eat the foods that we evolved with, and that's the key.
that's
And
right.
it's never balanced. It's never a
That's
balanced
right.
diet. The
Well, yeah, go ahead.
the whole dietetics profession begins in the 1960s as the industrial diet takes over, because now, instead of,
Mm,
before then, your mother taught you what to eat, and her mother had taught her,
that's
and
right.
so and that's how we ate. And then all of a sudden, you had this complete diversion, and mothers stopped cooking, and so they had to present you with this prepared foods, and that was the beginning of the end, because now the dietitian had to come along and say you must balance up, because you must have so many calories from carbohydrates, and you've got to get your iron, etc. But that was never an issue until 1965. We just ate what our mothers put on our plates, and she learned what was healthy from her mother,
That's
and
right.
so it goes back.
Okay. And then you think about, I guess I want to hear your thoughts on the types of studies that we use. Most of the nutritional science that I've read, and I had Nina Teicholz on the podcast, and when she explained that literally all the dietary guidelines are based on observational studies, epidemiological studies, it's really not as helpful. So, what's your thoughts on those two types of studies and why we harm ourselves when we depend on studies that don't really show causation?
The problem with associational studies is that healthy people eat what they're told is healthy.
Hmm.
And they may be healthy because they're doing everything. I mean, I try to think, if I was to say that if I'm going to live to 100, would it have been my diet? But I did all these other things as well. And I live in a lovely environment, and I've got money to do what I need to do. How do we know that that's not the factor that explains my health rather than my diet? Let me add that the carbohydrate diet was killing me and would have killed me already. So that, getting rid of that diet, but how are we to say that if you weren't eating the diet I'm already eating, that you'd be healthy? So the problem is, it's the healthy people do what they're told, and they run marathons, and they do
Hmm.
all sorts of things. And the other point that Nina didn't actually make was that most of those studies come from Harvard. And who do they study? Middle class white males and females living in the northeast of America. And that's who they look at. Now, I have a position now at the Cape Peninsula University of Technology, which is a highly racially integrated college. And there are very few people there with my face color, which is fantastic. And they they tell you, listen, even in our communities in South Africa, you can't say that that community must eat this food, because we know from our studies that they're biologically slightly different. There's some slight difference. And they're not going to do best on the diet that you're prescribing for a mainly white audience. And so the subtleties are all there, and we have to appreciate that. Yeah.
That's right. And I just think that, again, that's why I wanted to have this conversation. And our goal today, guys, is not to point you to a particular diet. We're a little biased towards a carb restricted lifestyle, but if you can eat a vegetarian diet and thrive and have metabolic health, and we have a way to measure that, then go ahead and do it. We want to make sure that people are just able to just think broader. When you hear other people talk about their approach, I want you to listen to them, but I also want you to make sure the studies that you look at are based on, that show causation. So those randomized controlled trials. And it's not that you ignore the epidemiological studies. You certainly, they have their purpose too. But their purpose is to tell you what needs further study. We don't make conclusions from those studies. And I think it's really important. And that's what's kind of got us into a bad spot. And just remember, most of the guidelines that are followed by, from the USDA, the dietary guidelines, which then affects everything else, those studies were not done with the right types of, those guidelines are not written the right way. So anyway, I just wanted to say that. I think it's really important. And I do want to, I want to ask you about your True North. You're doing a lot of great work. And so I want to understand, like, how are you spending your time? And what's your, before you rest your head in the ground somewhere, well, where do you want to see the world, maybe 5 or 10 years down the road from a nutritional perspective?
Tony, I think that I'm very similar to Nina Teicholz, and the reason I have a great affinity for her is that my problems with my profession started in 2014, and I was charged with telling people to eat the wrong diet, and I was killing them, and I was going to kill millions of children. That was one of the complaints, because I told them to eat according to the South African dietary guidelines, which are exactly the same as the World Health Organization.
Right.
And so and in fact, the key prosecution witness was the lady who wrote the South African dietary guidelines, which said you must raise your children on a high-fat diet. When I said it, it was wrong. And during the trial, she said, no, because you didn't mention cereals. That's why we had to take it.
Oh my God.
And she was under the influence of the cereal industry, obviously. So the
Well,
Maize
there you
industry
go.
particularly. So Nina's
Yeah.
book came out just at the time that I was having to start defending myself. And I read that book and I thought, oh my gosh, how
That's
beautiful is this book?
So is that how she ended up being part of the team that testified on your behalf?
That's correct. Yeah.
Wow.
Because I knew that she's the best,
She,
for
yeah, she's, what's interesting about her is she's about the business of really making sure that we express these messages with evidence, right? So, but you can feel it in her voice. You can see it in her tweets. You can see it in, she's just like really out there. She has a real purpose in that. And I appreciate both you guys for kind of leading us in those respects. So, but I do, again, as I kind of get towards the end of this conversation, I always ask my guests a very simple question, because we want to protect Nina. We want to protect you, keep you guys healthy, right? So, as you could imagine, when I came up with the Nest and Rope acronym, I learned the root cause of disease, and the nest really speaks to nutrition. I always throw a little intermittent fasting in there for those who want to do that. The E is for exercise, less stress and more sleep are the S's, and the T is for how we think and also avoiding trauma. But then you have to climb up that nest. We're humans. We don't have wings, right? So in order to get to the nest, we have a rope, and the rope deals with relationships, making sure they are positive, avoiding organisms and pollution. That could be dietary or environmental. And then, of course, making sure we have life experiences that still serve us, and also that we protect our emotions. So when you think about that Nest and Rope acronym, and you think about your life and what you need to focus on over the next year, what areas do you feel you're going to give the most attention?
I think all of them, because I can still.
You're the second person to say that, and that's a great answer. That's why I came up with this motto. Thank you for that. I love that. So all
No,
of them is a great answer.
absolutely. I mean, yeah. We're complex. We're complex organisms in a complex society, and we have to address all those issues.
I
And
love it.
at times, it's easier to do some. So that the one time, for example, when I was running marathons, I was just focusing on the exercise, and everything else was might have fallen apart. But now I realize you've got to pay attention to all of them, and
All of
particularly
it.
relationships, but everything. It's right.
Everything. And in
Yeah.
fact, I'm blessed to be part of the low carb team with the diet doctor. And I have a column I write every month. And the next topic it'll come out, I think it's the third Friday of every month. And I'm talking about sleep. And one of the things I've mastered is sleep. I've been really doing a good job with that, because if you have I have a full day. I mean, it's we're recording this at 5 a.m. In Chicago, and probably 1 or so p.m. for you in South Africa. But I have a full day, and if I don't get enough sleep, it's not going to go very well. So I agree with you. I think that's a great answer. I hope you don't mess up the rest of my guests. They're going to cheat. So thank you for that. And I guess as we wrap up, I want to make sure that people know how to reach you if they need to. Any final takeaways, but more importantly, how do people support the cause that you have and get your book even? So what would be the best way to do that?
Yeah, thanks, Danny. I think the best would be to go to the Noakes Foundation website. And, we've slowly been building this up over the last 10 years or so. And in the last 3 years, we've started the Nutrition Network, which I know you know about. And that's really taken off. And we had a very successful summit over the weekend, which was just amazing. We had 400 people who subscribed to it for 3 days of really hard work. We're
Nice.
currently training 9 people around the world, and literally there's one in South Africa, but the majority are from North America, Australia, Canada, and Britain. And these are the people who we want to train as nutrition scientists or nutritionists, but that 4 of them are doctors. I mean, it's just astonishing that people are getting so interested, and that's what I want to do, is to network all the people like yourself, everyone else who's working in this field. We What we learned from the people that we've worked with, we've trained 4,000 people now across the world. And the thing that they say without failure is, if we speak low carbs in our work, we get nailed. We're not allowed to talk about it. And it's so nice to be able to meet other people who've had exactly the same outcomes. And we're talking to people who know exactly what we're talking about. And we
Yeah.
had one guy in Singapore. He said, there's no one in all of Singapore that I can talk to. And Singapore is a very advanced state. Not one person I can speak to there who promotes a low carbohydrate diet. And that's his frustration. So that's what I would really like to build, this network around the world of people who like-minded like ourselves and who are helping patients. That's the only way we're going to ever change the dietary guidelines.
We all have our role to play, and ironically, I'm gonna have Doug with Low Carb USA on the next episode. I wanted him to come on and talk a little bit about the society for
Yes.
metabolic, clinicians like myself, and I think that we all have a role to play. I want to do a shout out to Adele Height for her role in creating guidelines so that clinicians like me feel more comfortable practicing a keto lifestyle for our patients. And so I think we all have a role to play. And I really want to celebrate the work you're doing. I'll try to do my part. I think we all have a role to play, and I really appreciate that. So I want to thank you, Professor, for giving us a little homework today. And the homework for everybody listening and or watching is that we need to go to the website and provide some support I'm sure every dollar matters, whether it's $10 or $100 or whatever. We need to support what we believe in. And I really do believe in the work you're doing. So I want to thank you as we wrap up, and I'll give a few closing comments, and really appreciate you. So today, guys, we had the gift of learning from a professor whose sacrifices have emboldened many of us in the keto community to have the courage to be enthusiastic champions of the carb restricted lifestyle. Today, our professor has provided a historical perspective that reassures us that the consumption of meat is not only something that we should be doing to be more healthy, but for many of us, probably is the most ancestral appropriate diet. So no matter where your search takes you, when you try to figure out your most appropriate diet, it's nice to know that we can, think of ourselves as hunters and gatherers, if that's our background, and have the confidence to eat exactly what the professor has suggested. So I hope you really enjoyed this episode and will share it with anybody who is still questioning or concerned about meat consumption. I really appreciate you guys. So I appreciate everybody listening who had a chance to check us out today. And as I close, I want you to be safe, be well, and to continue to protect your nest. Thank you so much, Professor.
Fantastic, Tony. Lovely morning spent with you. Have a wonderful day. And again, thank you for inviting me. It's been very, very
Absolutely.
special for me.
Thank you.